I appreciate you being here this evening. We're going to continue our study from the life of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah. And I'll refer to 2 Chronicles 32, but we'll mostly be in 2 Kings chapter 18 tonight. Because I've taught this biographical series in kind of a disjointed way, I want to go back and kind of revisit some information so that you can keep your grasp of where we are. A little bit of Assyrian history, and I do mean a little bit because I know a little bit of that goes a long way. But Assyria is one of the nations in human history that is really underrepresented in the way we think about history. The fact is, the Assyrian Empire lasted for more than 500 years. So we know about Rome and we know about Alexander the Great, but the fact is the Assyrian Empire deserves some attention. So let me just give you some highlights. Assyria began to dominate the world scene beginning in about 1114 BC, 1100 years before Jesus. There was a king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser I. I don't know how much your European and Middle Eastern map understanding is in your head, but let me give you some boundaries. The Assyrian Empire went from the Caspian Sea westward across southern Russia to the Black Sea. It went south through Greece and Macedonia, across the Mediterranean to Egypt, Arabia, and Israel, and eventually to the Persian Gulf. Lasting 500 years, it was really a king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III who started troubling God's people. He is the king that first moved south and began to assault Israel. His successor was a king by the name of Shalmaneser V. He laid siege to Samaria, which is a biblical geographical reference to Israel, the 10 northern kingdoms. Shalmaneser V laid siege, but it was his successor, Sargon II, who would finally overrun Israel in 721 BC. It was in that year, 721, that Israel, the 10 northern tribes, were carried off into captivity. They were relocated somewhere in the Assyrian Empire. Records fail us at that point because the Assyrians were intentional. There really were two different philosophies in the ancient world. The Babylonian Empire, which is eventually the empire that will carry Judah, the southern kingdom, off to exile. Their attitude was you disconnect a people group from their land. You separate them from their geographical roots, but you relocate them together so they are easier to rule, the Babylonians believed, because they don't have the motivation to fight for their homeland. The homeland is gone, but they do maintain their identity. They keep their customs and their habits, and so they can find a way to be content outside of their original homeland. So the Babylonians would relocate a people group, but keep them together. The Assyrians had the opposite strategy. Their idea was the only way to rule a people is for them to lose their identity and have nothing left except to become Assyrian. So when the 10 tribes were carried off in 721, Assyria would have dispersed those 10 tribes, probably by families, maybe by clans, but they would have spread them all over the empire. So that's why we talk about the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they really cease to exist. And there will be some, when we come back after Judah returns from Babylonian exile, there will be some remnants of Israel that will make their way back, and they'll have family ties, and they'll have tribal ties that they'll still hold on to. But by and large, those 10 northern tribes disappear. That was the Assyrian way. In 704, Sargon II was succeeded by a king named Sennacherib. And Sennacherib ruled until 681 BC. Now, Sennacherib is the one that we're going to find in this story of Hezekiah. The exile of Judah under the Babylonians is still 100 years away. But the Assyrians are the superpower of the day. Israel is gone. Judah is next on the agenda. And so the text that we're going to look at tonight speaks about the Assyrian king Sennacherib laying siege to Lachish. Lachish was probably the second most significant city after Jerusalem in the region at that time. He lays siege to Lachish and eventually defeats it. It is such an important event. This is a little bit surprising, but archaeology shows us that was such an important conquest to Sennacherib that there are 2 entire walls that have been discovered at Lachish picturing Sennacherib sitting on a throne as the ruler of that city. As soon as the city fell, the royal historians set to record the events. What's most interesting about that, to give you a little flavor of this man Sennacherib, we're gonna a spoiler here. We're gonna see his humiliation over the next couple of weeks as the story of Hezekiah unfolds. But to give you a little feel for what Sennacherib was like, one of the pictures carved in the mosaics on those walls in Lachish shows the king seated on a throne with the caption, Sennacherib, King of the world. Well, that's the historical context. That's where we are. I want to go back and pick up a little bit of what we've already covered real quickly because it sets the stage for what we're going to find. You'll see in the outline that I've given you tonight, it's fairly simple, the inevitability of battle. You'll recall that we looked at an error on the part of Hezekiah when Sennacherib makes demands of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, while Sennacherib was preoccupied with some domestic problems, Hezekiah broke the treaty that his father had established and basically declared independence from Assyria and separated Judah from its vassal. He discontinued their vassal standing with the Assyrians. By the time Sennacherib finally gets the home fires worked out and solves his domestic problems, he sets his sight on Judah, because he can't afford to have some postage stamp sized nation with an upstart king rebel against the Assyrian Empire and get away with it. And so as he begins to move south, Hezekiah, his first attempt is to accommodate this emperor that is on the horizon. You remember the story that we read the last time we met. He sends a message and says, I'm sorry, what can I do to make it up? And the king says, I want gold, and I want silver, and I want a lot of it. Hezekiah drains his royal treasury. He goes to the temple and strips the gold that it was used to decorate that. He melts down silver utensils. He collects as much as he can and sends it, basically trying to buy off this king. Look in 2 Kings chapter 18, and we'll start with verse 9. Now, we've seen these verses, but let's just blaze past them again. Now in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Samaria and besieged it. Now Samaria, remember, that's Israel. At the end of 3 years, they captured it. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was captured. Then the king of Assyria led Israel into exile to Assyria and put them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Now that's all the historical information we have right there in that verse. That's the only information available to a detective to try and begin to track down what happened to the northern tribes. Verse 12, this happened. Now, this is an editorial insertion. Understand, under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, the Bible is written not merely as a historical account, but as a historical account that is unfolding another more significant story, which in effect is the story of God. And so it's common for the Old Testament writers to tell you the historical events. This happened, and then this happened. It was in this year of this king's reign, and then this happened, and then they did this. And then you'll have a verse like this just inserted because the author, under the inspiration of the Spirit, wants you to understand what's really going on. Okay? Here, Samaria is captured. Israel is carried off into exile. Verse 12. This happened because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but violated his covenant. All that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded, they would neither listen nor do it. Now see, what's significant about that verse is you have the greatest superpower of that generation, the Assyrians. And in just a few verses, we're going to see what the Assyrians thought about themselves. Here they lay siege to Israel. 3 years, they defeat, they occupy, and then they deport. From a human perspective, it looks like this is nothing more than another historical example of the big guy eating the little guy. Except he wants us to have no mistake in how we understand these events. This didn't happen because Assyria was strong. This happened because the God who controls the events of human history had a people that he shared a covenant with, and they violated that covenant and refused to obey him. Now this is going to set the stage for where we're going, because the Assyrians are going to next come for Judah. They're going to come for Hezekiah. But it's important to have this kind of eternal perspective, and you're going to see I'm going to make an application why it's important for us to have this kind of eternal perspective, because Hezekiah, his first inclination is, I better buy off this king who's coming to invade me. He had seen what he did to Israel, but the fact is that didn't work. He gives him all of his gold. He gives him all of his silver. He strips the temple bare. And what does Sennacherib do? He deposits it in his royal treasury, and then he just keeps marching with his army. He's coming. He took their gold, but he wants their defeat. Hezekiah can't truly fight this battle until he remembers that God is the one who raises up nations and tears them down. That's going to be vital. And that's why verse 12 is inserted there, because it's critical, not just to the story of Israel, but to the story that we're going to see here in Judah. Now, I'm not going to cover all of these, but you see I've given you the reference 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 1 through 8. We covered that story the last time we met. That is the story of Hezekiah pays the money. The Assyrian army is still coming. So Hezekiah begins the process. Remember, he committed to repairing the walls and and hiding the water source. He forged weapons so that he could arm his population. And then those last two verses of that passage, 2 Chronicles chapter 32, 7 and 8, we're not going to read them, but you might go back and remind them, because that's where, somewhere between paying the money to the king and the king's arrival, we get to 2 Chronicles 32, 7 and 8, where he stands in front of a motley crew that he calls an army, and he says, listen, we have the advantage here. They must have been thinking, this guy has lost his mind. We have the advantage. There is not any part of this story that gives us the advantage. And he says, but we have something they don't have. We have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Somewhere between giving the money to the king and the arrival of the Assyrian army, Hezekiah came to himself. And he remembered the lesson of verse 12, that God is the one responsible. If Assyria is the superpower of the day, it's only because they are the big stick that God chooses to use to accomplish his purposes. And when that big stick is no longer useful to God, guess what happens? The Assyrian Empire falls. And actually, the Assyrian Empire, historically, will collapse under the pressure of the Babylonians, who are the new superpower on the rise. What we can't possibly see in this verse yet, what nobody historically could see, is that within 100 years, Judah is going to be carried off into exile. But 100 years from this encounter, Judah still exists as an independent nation, and the Assyrians are already in the history books. I want us to understand that, because we can take these military lessons and apply them to the spiritual battles of our day. And we've got to understand that God is no less the God of his people today than he was the God of Hezekiah and the people of Judah all those centuries ago. What that means is we look with worldly eyes, with fleshly eyes, and we say, man, the future of the church is in real danger. I don't know if Christianity can survive. It looks like the forces of secularism. It looks like the forces of communism. It looks like the anti-supernatural, anti-God worldviews are carrying the day. They're holding sway. But I tell you what, if Jesus doesn't come back in the next 100 years, here's one thing I know. The church will still be here. I can't speak for Russia or China or the U.S., but the church will still be here. Why? Because God raises up nations, uses them to his purposes, and then sets them aside when he no longer has use for them. The only thing that is promised to never disappear is the church of Jesus Christ. It's important for us to have that kind of eternal mindset as we face the battles, the culture wars, if you will, of our generation. Now, back to 2 Kings 18. Let's begin in verse 17. Well, let's do verse 13. You know I'm just winging it. Don't laugh. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, marched against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. Now think about this from a military standpoint. You have Jerusalem, which is the crown jewel. It's the capital city. There are smaller cities that are fortified, and then there are dozens of unfortified villages. What Sennacherib is doing is what a good military general does, is his sights are set on Jerusalem, but he goes systematically to each of the fortified cities. He's not going to leave a walled city filled with his enemies behind him near his supply lines. So he's systematically zigzagging from the north to the south with his eyes on Jerusalem. That's what's happening here. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent messengers to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. These are the verses where he gives the silver. Now drop down to verse 17. The king of Assyria takes the gold, but then here's where the story of Hezekiah gets really interesting right here, at least to me. Verse 17. Then the king of Assyria sent Tartan, Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. Now, by the way, that phrase translated large army, the Hebrew there really is stronger than that. It means a massive army. Okay? Under your second point, the initial attack of battle, I've listed the first level of attack, and this is both military tactics and spiritual warfare tactics. The first level of warfare is generally intimidation. What he does is the king doesn't come himself. He's still occupied with Lachish. He hasn't quite solved that problem, but he sends a massive army, and he sends three of his officers. Let me just give you that real quick. It says here that he sends Tartan, Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh. Now, those are not proper names. Those are probably titles. What most scholars think, especially those who have a little bit of those ancient languages like Akkadian, which was the language of the Babylonians, and also Assyrian, they tell us that Tartan was probably the chief commander of the Assyrian army. In other words, he would have been the 5-star general above all others in the military except for the king himself. The second, the Rabsaris, that word apparently means literally chief eunuch, but it probably refers to the head of the king's special unit or his bodyguards. It would have been a high-ranking military person as well. And then the Rabshakeh was another officer, but it seems to be that he is sort of like the Secretary of State. And he represents the king in negotiations with the people that they are attempting to conquer. So he sends these three officials, and this is what happens. With that large army, it says, so they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they went up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the road of the fuller's field. Then they called to the king, and Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the household, Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the secretary, went out to them. Now they show up. They're outside the walls of Jerusalem. They really have taken up a position on a fairly high point, so they can have communications with people who will be standing on the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And they call for the king. Well, the king doesn't come, obviously, just like Sennacherib sent his 3 main officers to represent him. Hezekiah is going to send 3 high-ranking officials as well. So these that are mentioned here, they go up to the wall to hear the message that is being delivered on behalf of Sennacherib. Verse 19. And Rabshakeh said to them, say now to Hezekiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. What is this confidence that you have? You say, but they are only empty words. I have a plan and strength for war. Now, on whom have you relied that you have revolted against me? Remember, he broke the treaty with Assyria. And so the question here is, he's putting words in Hezekiah's mouth. He's basically saying, you claim to have a plan. At some point, you knew we were coming. And you had to have figured out in your head what you were going to do when that day came. Well, today's the day, and here's the question. In your head, when you thought this through, who are you planning to rely on? When you revolted, when you threw off the yoke of Assyria, What were you thinking? Verse 21. Now behold, you have relied on the support of this broken reed on Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. That is how Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is to all who rely on him. In other words, the speculation is the only other power that could possibly challenge the Assyrians might be the Egyptians. Is that what you were thinking? Were you thinking that you would get the Egyptians to come alongside you? Well, here's the thing. Pharaoh is not dependable. In fact, he's so undependable that the people that rely on him, it's like leaning on a stick that ends up poking you in the hand and leaving a splinter. This is not a reliable ally. Verse 22. However, if you say to me, we have trusted in the Lord our God. Okay, Egypt's not your ally. Egypt's not who you're relying on. So you're gonna stand up with kind of a boldness, and you're gonna say, well, it's the God of Judah that we trust. Really? Isn't he the same God whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has removed, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now, let's understand. Here's one of the things that the enemy is always going to do. He's always going to use intimidation, which he's going to try and get you to think that you've lost before the battle even starts. That was the point of the big army. He didn't need a massive army to deliver this message. The army is to try and get Judah to surrender without a shot fired. But after intimidation, the enemy, whether it's a military enemy or particularly a spiritual enemy, the enemy is always characterized by arrogance. And what we have here is the Secretary of State, the Rabshakeh, who is not only full of himself, but he has no doubt that there is nobody on earth that can contend with Assyria. But look at what he says. In that verse, he said, you're going to tell me you're going to rely on your God. Isn't this the same God that Hezekiah tore down the high places of? Okay, now look how he's twisted facts here. Because when Hezekiah became king, you remember the first thing that he did was he issued an executive order, and he went out and had the high places, which were referred to as places where Yahweh was worshipped, but in actuality, they were places where competing gods were being worshipped. The high places were actually substitutes for the true worship of the true God. So he got rid of them. And he did say, come to Jerusalem, worship at the temple. Why? Because that's what God said. That was the plan. But the Assyrian is spinning that. And he's saying, you're depending on this God for support. Isn't this the same God that your king most certainly offended by destroying all of his places of worship and saying, you can only worship if you come to Jerusalem? As far as the Assyrians were concerned, that looked like a grab for money. Why let offerings be made at all of these extension places when we can make everybody come to Jerusalem and all the money can be here? That was probably what the Assyrians were thinking. But he suggests that God is not going to come to their defense because he's been offended by a king who destroyed all of his places of worship. That's not true. But in the arrogance of one who doesn't believe he answers to God, frankly, facts don't matter. If there's no arbiter of truth, then truth is up for grabs, and whoever's strongest gets to decide what's true. Does any of this sound familiar? All right. Look at where we are here. Verse 23. Now then, come make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. This is where the arrogance comes in. He goes, we'll make this a fair fight. I will give you 2,000 horses if you're able on your part to put riders on them. Just to make this battle that's coming up a sporting affair, we'll spot you 2,000 horses. Now, you're going to have to come up with your own riders. I don't know if you got 2,000 riders, but I'll make you a wager. We'll give you, it's like the pickup basketball game when you were a kid on the playground. And you go, we're going to beat you so bad, we'll give you our tallest guy, and we'll still beat you. Well, that's what he's doing here. Now, remember, picture the scene. Here's this massive army in the background. Here are these 3 Assyrian officials speaking at the top of their lungs to 3 Jewish officials standing on the wall. But guess what? They're not the only ones standing on the wall. Representatives of the nation of Judah that have assembled themselves for safety reasons behind the walls of Jerusalem, they're listening to this conversation. That's really what's going on here. He says, take this message to Hezekiah, but Rabshakeh, he's talking to the people of Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he's trying to win the battle with psychological warfare. I'll make you this wager, verse 23. Verse 24. How then can you drive back even one official of the least of my master's servants and rely on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. Now that's interesting. This is a great psychological piece of warfare. Because what he says is, you think we got here by accident? Actually, it's your God who called us to do this. You've been betrayed by your own spiritual deity. Now here's the thing. One of the things in the Old Testament that offends God the most, and it doesn't matter if it's somebody in Israel or somebody in Judah or somebody in Assyria or any other nation, God is offended when you use his name and say, God said this or God told me that, and God didn't say that. I mean, one of the things that God speaks in the prophets, man, he hammers the false prophets because they were false prophets because they stood up and said, thus saith the Lord, when God has not said that. Well, here's a pagan with the audacity, the absolute lack of respect for the God of Judah, that he lays claim that their God is on his side. We're here because your God has betrayed you. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Roha said to Rabshakeh, speak now to your servants in Aramaic, because we understand it, and do not speak with us in Judean, so that the people who are on the wall hear you. Now this is a little bit of desperation here, because what their request is, they realize what's happening. He's delivering a message to be carried to the king, but he's really talking to the people on the wall. Well, he's probably, Rabshakeh, the Assyrian, is probably, it doesn't say, I assume he's speaking through a translator, but he's speaking in Judean, or what we would call Hebrew, the language that the people understood. The official language of the elite class, the language of government, the language of more technical international negotiations, sort of the English of the day, was Aramaic. So the officials standing on the wall, they understood Aramaic, but they knew by and large the people didn't. So they make a plea and say, listen, before we go any further in this conversation, can we shift over to Aramaic? And you just talk to us, and we'll take it to the king. But Rabshakeh is not having any of that. He's speaking the language of the people because the people are his real audience. Okay? Verse 27. But Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me only to your master and to you to speak these words? Has he not also sent me to the men who sit on the wall, doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? Now, what he's doing in that verse is, this would have been common knowledge in the ancient world. He's describing the last gasp stage of a city under siege. The way a siege worked in the ancient world was basically all supply lines were cut off and a city couldn't get anything in or out. And what you do, if you had enough army and you had enough supplies and resources, you literally just camped until everybody inside the wall starved to death. What he's describing is another arrogant act of intimidation. He's suggesting that they might as well hear this for themselves, because they're going to find themselves not too much further down the road surrounded by this army, and they're going to find themselves eating their own dung and drinking their own urine, which is always the very last stage before a city either surrenders or they all die. That's what he's doing here. Verse 28. Then Rabshakeh stood up and shouted with a loud voice in Judean, saying, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to save you from my hand. And do not let Hezekiah lead you to trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will certainly save us, and this city will not be handed over to the king of Assyria." Don't listen to your king. All of that blather about God rescuing you, about God defeating the most powerful army on the face of the earth, listen, that's just, he's just pulling your leg. He's just trying to trick you, because there's no hope here. I mean, your situation is hopeless. In fact, he says, I can prove it's hopeless. Look at the next verses. Verse 31. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for this is what the king of Assyria says. Make your peace with me and come out to me and eat, each one from his vine and each from his fig tree, and drink each one the waters of his own cistern. Now, get this. This feels more and more like spiritual warfare. Because what he's suggesting is, listen, we don't want to hurt anybody. In fact, if you'll just submit to Assyrian rule, you can eat fruit, you can drink water from your own cistern. I mean, life will be good. He's going to paint a picture of a utopia. Follow my king. He's the only king in this conversation who actually has the power to make your life okay. Is that not the temptation straight from the devil? I mean, every sin is essentially this same argument. Why would God tell you that you can't have sex with whoever you want to have sex with? Why would God tell you that you should follow the rules, that you should obey the laws, that you should not cheat on your taxes? Listen, follow me. Live your authentic self and do what you want. And I will give you the life that you've earned, that you've yearned for. Listen, it's propaganda. It's a lie from a liar. And that's what's happening here. You know, this idea that if you surrender to us, you can go home. You can eat from your vineyard. You can pull the vegetables out of your garden. Your life is going to be great. It'll be better under us. But here you go. You can eat from your vine. You can eat from your own fig tree. You can drink the waters of your own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees producing oil and of honey, so that you will live and not die. The enemy will always offer you a vision of something better than you have. and he'll suggest that God is holding out on you. Let's go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. What did God say? Well, Eve said, God said we can have anything of the abundance of this gorgeous garden. We can eat the fruit of any tree here except that one tree right there. He said, don't eat from that tree. Everything else in this wonderland of bounty, he's given to us for our pleasure. Really? There's that one tree over there? Why didn't he want you to eat from that tree? I don't know, but look at everything he's given us. Yeah, I see all that, but there's got to be something special about that tree. I think God's holding out on you. I think he knows that if you eat from that tree, you're going to be like him. I think he knows that making a choice of your own free will is the only thing keeping you from having everything that he has. Yeah, you can live in this garden if that's what you want for the rest of your life. Or you can have more. And you know what she did? She considered it. And when she considered it, she said, well, it is an attractive tree. And it does produce appetizing looking fruit. And there's really no good reason why I can't eat out of that tree while I can eat out of every other tree. You ever notice we do that? God says do something or don't do something. And because he doesn't explain the why to us, we assume that there's no why behind the command. You know, have you ever raised children? What did your mama tell you? Why do I have to do that? Because I said so. That is a particularly unsatisfying answer to a child. But as an adult, what I realized is it's simply an answer that says, you don't need to know the reason. It's enough that I know the reason. God doesn't owe us an explanation, but a life lived by trust and faith is a life that says, I don't know why I can't eat from that tree, but God knows best. And if I don't know anything else, I'm going to hold on to that. Well, here he is. He's offering this utopia. Just come, we'll carry you off. You know, it's like he almost implies we'll put you on some padded cushions and we'll just get horse-drawn carriages and they'll just take you to Wonderland. Well, you know, the reality is when you're conquered, you become a slave and anywhere you go is by forced march. That's the reality of this offer, but it's painted with all the wonders of utopia. But do not listen to Hezekiah, verse 32, because he misleads you by saying the Lord will save us. Now here's the next step, okay? The first step is intimidation. He shows the massive army. The second step is arrogance. He paints this picture of the king who is greater than their king, not only greater than their king, but greater than their God. And then he promises utopia. But now he's going to really turn the screws because at this point, he gives one more persuasive argument. It's an argument from historical circumstance. Look at what he says. He said, don't let him mislead you by saying the Lord will save us. Verse 33. Has any of the gods of the nations actually saved his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? Have they saved Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands are there who have saved their land from my hand, that the Lord would save Jerusalem from my hand? Okay, here's what he does. He says, Let's look at historical circumstance. The king of Assyria is on an unbroken string of victories. And guess what? All those defeated nations, they all had gods too. Did it help them? Not a bit. In fact, not only did they have gods, in fact, if you want to suggest that maybe it's just because their gods weren't real gods, but you have a real God. Well, didn't you share the same God with Israel? And did that God that you are relying on, did he come to Israel's aid? Didn't we scoop up those 10 tribes and return them to Assyria? Didn't we disperse them so they'll never be found again, lost into the pages of history? Is that the God you're talking about? Well, here's the thing about the enemy. Whether it's 681 BC or 2022 AD, the enemy is still underestimating God. He attacks the reputation of the king of Hezekiah. He makes false promises of the utopia that's awaiting Judah if they'll just surrender. But most of all, what seals Assyria's fate is he misrepresents the character and the power of the one true God. Before we see the response of Hezekiah, let's talk about this just for a minute. We're going to have to come to the place as the people of God in our generation where we recognize intimidation for what it is, where we see arrogance and we are able to identify what is offered to us that's really propaganda. The reason the church, by and large, is not yet strong enough to face the culture. I'm not waving a white flag, but hear me out. The reason I believe that the church is not yet strong enough to face what's coming is because not only are we not understanding intimidation, arrogance, and propaganda, you have to go back to the first point. We're still stuck at accommodation. We're still trying to buy off the bad guys, hoping that if we compromise, they'll just leave us alone. Let me give you some examples. Homosexual activists told us not that many years ago that all they wanted was for us to allow their behavior. And so we did. But now, all of a sudden, they want our approval of their behavior. Progressives said, we just want a neutral, value-free curriculum in our schools. Well, guess what? Today they want critical race theory and a naturalistic curriculum that is light years away from being value neutral, as if there is such a thing. We tried to buy off the atheists because they said, we want separation of church and state. Okay. Well, guess what? Today they want the complete silence of the church. It's never enough. You can't buy them off. You can't appease the enemy. The seculars say, we just want sexual permission to live our lives. Except they said they wanted sexual permission, but now they want sexual perversion. I saw a teacher, an elementary school teacher in another place, who said that 40% of the students in her 4th grade class identify somewhere along the spectrum of LGBTQ, ABC, XYZ. Really, 40% of elementary school kids? When 5 years ago, no kid in the 4th grade even knew what any of that was. Well, here's the thing. Liberal politicians said, we just want the church to cooperate with the state. Let me tell you what's coming. Soon they're not going to be satisfied until the church is controlled by the state. But until we can get to the place where we stop trying to buy them off, hoping they'll leave us alone, we're not ready to face the battle of intimidation, arrogance, and propaganda. We were in Chicago a couple of summers ago, and I wouldn't live in Chicago for $1 million, but I liked a vacation there. I like that city. And we were walking around downtown, and a lot of churches, a lot of grand architecture. I mean, just one church. I mean, every denomination was there, and these churches are just gorgeous. I mean, just stunningly beautiful. And every single downtown Chicago church that we walked past, regardless of their denomination, every one of them had a pride flag hanging over their front door. Well, if we hang a pride flag, maybe they'll just let us be. You know why they won't let us be? Not because they're more horrible than any other secularist kind of person. I'm not particularly antagonized by homosexuals more than other people. But the reason they won't let us be is because the same way Rob Shaka represents the real enemy, Sennacherib, these activists, they're simply speaking for somebody that's behind them pulling the strings. And he has hated the people of God from the very beginning. It doesn't matter what we give up. It doesn't matter what compromise we make. It doesn't matter what we agree to. He's not stopping until we're not here anymore. So we have two choices. We have the same choice that Judah faces here. We can buy into the hope of the utopia. If the secularists are in charge, if we just stop the fight, maybe things will settle into a new normal and everything will be okay. Or we can realize that forced marches and deportation, that's what they're after. Well, I don't want to scare you. I don't want to depress you. What I'm telling you is, battle is inevitable. So we either fight now or we fight later when the church is just that much weaker than it is today. Well, let's see what Hezekiah does. Verse 36. But the people were silent and did not answer him with even a word, because it was the king's command. They had been instructed, nobody speaks to the representatives of the Assyrian king. That is an official responsibility for leadership. You stay silent. And the people honored the king's command. Nobody said a word. Verse 37. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the household, and Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the secretary, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, and they reported to him the words of Rabshakeh. Their initial, I believe, inspired response to this intimidation and fear that they had been presented with. They refused to argue with their enemies, and they made an immediate display of humility before God. We have to be convinced that God is God, regardless of what the world tells us about God. He said, your God has betrayed you. He's actually sent us here. We're tools in His hand. He's not going to protect you. Folks, that was a lie from the minute the thought entered his mind until the words came out of his mouth. And Judah's only hope was to hold on to what they understood about who God was. Do not let, I've said this before, and only half jokingly, I've often said I love it when people who don't follow Jesus get mad at me because I'm doing it wrong. Do not listen to what the world has to say about what God or Jesus would do. Because the Jesus they invoke is always some sort of progressive socialist version of Jesus that agrees 100% with whatever their viewpoints are. You know, there's the PETA Jesus. And there's the secular Jesus. And there's the Jesus of love. Oh, this is the best one, the most common one. Well, God is a God of love. Well, what about justice? Well, God provides justice. Well, how does the God of love provide justice? Well, He gets rid of all the oppressive Christians. Don't listen to the secular world explain to us who God is. There's one way to know God. He's revealed Himself. He tells us who He is in His Word. That's why we have to be in His Word, because this is how we evaluate the lies that they're constantly telling us. Well, humility was their first response, and that needs to be our first response. Listen, don't hear me playing onward Christian soldiers and saying that we need to go take out the enemy. That's not what I mean. There is a way to fight this battle. Paul tells us in the New Testament that we don't battle with weapons of flesh and blood, because our enemy is not of flesh and blood. We win flesh and blood battles. We win culture wars by spiritual means. The first of which is humility. We acknowledge to each other and in the presence of God that we are not up to winning this battle. If it rests with us, it's already lost. We have to go all the way back to verse 12 and remind ourselves of an eternal perspective that says God raises up nations and He tears down nations to suit His purpose. And so what we want to do is we want to, in humility, we want to just align ourselves with His purpose. You want to know how to be on the right side of things? You join the winning team. Well, humility. But then the second thing is dependence. And I want you to see this verse, the first verse of chapter 19. Now when King Hezekiah heard the report, he tore his clothes, that's humility. He covered himself with sackcloth, that's humility. And he entered the house of the Lord. Flip over real quickly to verse 20 of 2 Corinthians chapter 32, and you'll see the parallel. It gives us a little different detail. 2 Corinthians 32:20, it says, but King Hezekiah and Isaiah, the prophet who served in the royal household, King Hezekiah and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, prayed about this and called out to heaven for help. You want to know how this war was going to be won? Hezekiah made God his first counselor, his primary advisor, and his immediate source. We've got to be involved. We've got to be culturally engaged. We've got to be politically outspoken. But that in and of itself is not the way that we win. We win by humbling ourselves before God and declaring our dependence on Him and on Him alone. Let me leave you with this. We finish this passage with Hezekiah on his knees in the temple. That's how we know that the next part of this story is going to be something spectacular, because something supernatural is about to happen. So how about with us? For something supernatural to happen in our nation, in our generation, we don't need more picket signs. We need more prayer warriors. Because we don't fight flesh and blood. We fight the principalities and the powers, who, by the way, already know they've been defeated. Father, thank you for your word, for the life of Hezekiah and what we are drawing from it, what we are learning here. Lord, I pray that as we continue this story and as we come next week to one of the greatest moments in the Old Testament, Father, give us the confidence that none of this story is from ages past and it's just fairy tales, but remind us that the God of Hezekiah is the God of Evergreen. And Lord, let us be a humble and prayerful people, drawing strength from your throne and living in the power of your sovereignty. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.